Hello again, students. I'm back. I'm sorry it took me so long to get back to you all. I really am doing the best that I can. That being said, I want to say how much I appreciate all of your patience, all the kind words, thoughts, and prayers that you've sent my family's way. I'd like to ask you that you remember that your classmates are probably also going through some very tough times, as we all are. Um, so let's I'm sending my kind thoughts and prayers and wishes and energy and vibes towards all of you. And I hope you do it to each other as well, whether you know each other or not. We are a community and we all need support, whether we know we have it or not. So just wanted to say that. Also wanted to say that I know we're fast approaching your midterm and you need some feedback and you need some grades. Um, I'm going to get the last little bit of the materials for next week posted up today so that you guys can have them, as well as the midterm for you all so that the review and stuff will be available in plenty of time. And then tomorrow I'm going to get started on the grading. Please keep your eyes open as the grades and the comments start coming in, and I will probably, because I'm so far behind, come up with a plan to make this a little more fair than I feel that it is right now. I'll let you all know that in another announcement as soon as I figure something out for you all. Anyhow, today we're going to talk about the early Cold War in Latin America. I'm going to start by giving you some context on early leftist movements and then Latin America at the start of the Cold War. We'll talk about the onset of the Cold War in a global perspective so we can kind of get the US's perspective on what starts happening in Latin America a little bit better. And then we'll talk about two of the first revolutions in this period, the Bolivian National Revolution, and then the revolution, a democratic revolution that takes place in Guatemala in the 1940s, that's then overthrown in the 1950s with help from the United States. So we'll be talking about all of that today. I do want to begin with a review of the theoretical frameworks as we are quickly approaching the midterm. I need you to take these with you. So realism. Realism generally focuses on military power, but it can also focus on economic power, cultural power, like soft power, such as cultural diplomacy, things of this nature. But it sees states as unitary actors, meaning we're not worried about differing political parties or public opinion or any of these things. The state is an actor that pursues itself into interest in an anarchic international system, meaning there's no world government. That's realism. Dependency theory. Dependency theory is going to focus on economic relationships. This is one of the major reasons why it was the best answer for that first question on the activity about the documentary Banana Split. We were talking about an economic relationship between the global North and the global South in regards to the banana trade. And under dependency theory, wealthy nations maintain a state of underdevelopment in poorer nations by exploiting natural resources without sharing the benefits of the profits with poorer nations. Okay. And then liberal institutionalism focuses on international institutions and their ability to influence powerful nations. It also focuses on cooperation and the idea that cooperation between states can benefit all parties. Okay? We have any questions about these theories or how to apply them? This is the week to try to talk to me about that, okay? All right. So moving on, I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of Latin American context before we dig into the Cold War, so you kind of understand what's happening on the ground in Latin America, as opposed to the way that maybe the U.S. perceives what is happening on the ground in Latin America. So we're going to talk about early leftist movements, a rising nationalism and populism in the region, and some of their post-war economics ideas, and some of the ways that U.S.-Latin American relations change at the end of World War II. So early leftist movements in Latin America develop in the same way they do in the United States. In the 19th century, masses of European immigration is going to bring new political ideas with them, including socialism, communism, and anarchism. If you do not know the meanings to those words, I'm not going to get into a huge philosophical discussion about the differences between these ideologies, but they are different, no matter how the media may present them. And I suggest that you take some time to educate yourself on the differences between those ideas. So leftist movements in Latin America are going to reject Eurocentric capitalism, authoritarian governing models, and U.S. interventions in Latin America. They are going to come to support new populist leaders, and they're going to develop new nationalist ideas, including ideas of ethnic nationalism that are going to contrast very strongly with some of the ideas of white supremacy that are still radiating out of the United States and Western Europe. Now, in 1946, when the World War II is over and the Cold War begins, almost all countries in the world had communist parties and communists that were within the labor unions that were operating in these countries. So communism was not just a Soviet export, it was everywhere. This is also a period where Latin American populism begins to take off. And populism is a political strategy in which politicians appeal to the masses who feel disregarded by established elites. And these populist leaders, they implement policies that help the working class in exchange for their political support. So they expand voting rights, pass labor regulations, they create social welfare programs, things of that nature. They also promote economic nationalism, or the idea that a nation should control and benefit from the exploitation of its natural resources. This leads to expropriations, like in the 30s in Mexico and Bolivia, of oil. Later on, there are going to be some more nationalizations that are going to catch the U.S. eye. During the Good Neighbor policy, these expropriations, these policies weren't challenged in the same way by the United States. A few examples of these populist leaders would be Hipólito Yrigoyen and Juan Perón in Argentina, Getulio Vargas in Brazil, Victor Raúl Aya de la Torre in Peru. So it's pretty much across the entire region that these populists begin to take over. Now, as the United States begins to focus on the recovery in Europe, it tells Latin American leaders that they're going to cut off the economic aid they had been receiving during World War II. And the U.S. encourages Latin American leaders to make their economies attractive to investment by private U.S. capital, which means lessening labor and environmental regulations and doing those kinds of things, lowering taxes on them and that kind of thing, deregulating. But Latin American leaders are going to continue policies of economic nationalism, state-led development, and state interference in the economy that they had began in the early 20th century. Some changes happen in the region as a result of the end of the war. So in February of 1945, the Treaty of Chapultepec establishes the framework for regional cooperation, and that forms the basis for the emergence of what's known as the Organization of American States, formed in 1948. This includes Latin American nations as well as the United States and Canada. In April of 1945, Latin American nations that became part of the OAS also became part of the founding members of the United Nations. And the creation of the OAS and the United Nations and Latin America's involvement in them commits Latin American leaders to international cooperation as well as hemispheric cooperation during the Cold War. The United States while they won't offer economic aid, they begin to offer military equipment and training to friendly, meaning anti-communist regimes, beginning in 1945. In 1946, the U.S. opens the School of the Americas, which we will talk more about. In the Canal Zone, the School of Americas was a military training facility that taught counterinsurgency tactics to be used against suspected leftist subversives during the Cold War in Latin America. In 1947, they formed the Rio Pact, which is a formal continuation of the security agreements of World War II. The Rio Pact was supposed to keep the hemisphere together in opposition to the spread of Soviet communism. And these agreements are going to help the U.S. influence Latin American leaders, as well as to intervene indirectly in Latin America through these leaders that they have influenced. If that makes any sense to you. Under the United Nations, a new economic commission forms. It's the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLAC in English, or CEPAL in Spanish. And its main objective is to facilitate economic development in Latin America. And its leaders become very instrumental in guiding development and trade strategies in the region after World War II. The first of these is Raul Prebisch, who becomes the first director of ECLAC-CEPAL in 1950. He also releases an influential study called The Economic Development of Latin America and Its Principal Problems. He introduces a new theory known as structuralism. So structuralism argues that even though core or the center and peripheral nations are joined by global commerce, center nations benefit disproportionately from that relationship. So these are the wealthy nations. Trade imbalances keep the periphery in a perpetual state of underdevelopment. So this is the foundation upon which dependency theory is built, is Prebisch's idea of structuralism. So Prebisch is going to conclude that Latin America needs to prioritize heavy industry, the development of heavy industry under state ownership, expanding manufacturing and other industries, and intervening in the economy to gain a more favorable balance of trade for Latin America. So structuralism goes against the previous prevailing economic theory of modernization. Let's recall that modernization theory postulated that all countries would arrive at a high state of development through the same path that other nations developed. Structuralism challenges this by saying that those nations that have already developed are keeping the underdeveloped nations from doing so. In the 1960s, structuralism becomes dependency theory, meaning that forces completely beyond the control of Latin American leaders, such as the inequality between nations in the global system, kept Latin America dependent on larger, more developed nations. So some theorists in the 1960s are going to see dependency theory and suggest Marxist revolution to be the only way to get Latin America out of this cycle of dependence. Others are going to suggest this mixed model of private investment and state-sponsored development. So here you see kind of an illustration of dependency theory, where poor nations are spoon-feeding fat, rich nations. I just think it's kind of funny. All right, so with all of that context, we're going to come back to the end of World War II, and I'm going to kind of build a global context on what's happening in the world as the Cold War starts, okay? So once the Cold War begins, critics of leftist movements are going to take all these different socialist, communist, anarchist movements and clump them all together under this label of just the left. During this time, the United States is in the grip of McCarthyism, or the Red Scare, which is basically the practice of accusing people of communism despite there being no evidence. And they're beginning to look at Latin American leaders who are invoking policies of economic nationalism that they were invoking in the decades prior as being un-American and potentially being a sign of communism beginning to influence these policy decisions. So this is the kind of mindset in the United States. At the end of World War II, the U.S. is an unchallenged power in the Western Hemisphere and one of two superpowers in the world. Europe's completely devastated by the war, and the economic devastation is a ripe breeding ground for the spread of communism. And Stalin's Red Army is still in Europe. And even as negotiations at the end of the war are taking place, Eastern Europe's falling behind what becomes known as the Iron Curtain. So you can see here in the map, everything in red is behind the Iron Curtain and owned by the Soviet Union. Everything in blue is considered Western Europe and part of the free world. In response to the threat in Europe, Truman comes out with the Truman Doctrine. This is also known as containment. He declares that the U.S. will resist communist aggression worldwide, that the U.S. would do whatever it took. And so here we have an illustration of the U.S. throwing a ton of money on Europe to try to fight this virus of communism that's hanging in the air. In 1948, the reign of money begins. It's officially known as the European Recovery Program, but more popularly known as the Marshall Plan. And the U.S. pledged over $12 billion in economic assistance to Europe. Remember, they've cut off economic aid of this type to Latin America. In 1949, Western Europe joins the United States in a military alliance known as NATO. It's an alliance against the Soviet Union. And here you can see the NATO countries in blue. Also in 1949, Mao Zedong's communist revolution is victorious in the Chinese Civil War. And across the US, pundits began to ask, who lost China to the communists? And as you can see in the illustration, not only is the U.S. going to be concerned with Soviet expansion and influence, but they are also going to be concerned with communist China getting its tentacles into Southeast and East Asia. And in 1950, the Chinese-backed North Koreans began to fight against the U.S.-supported South Koreans. This becomes this is the Korean War, and we are still at war. We're just in an armistice. If you're interested, look that up. How North Korea got us to call an armistice. And in 1954, Ho Chi Minh defeats the French, and his communist army takes over in Vietnam. In response to Ho Chi Minh's victory in Vietnam, President Eisenhower argues that if Vietnam falls to communism, the rest of South Asia, South and East Asia would follow as well. This is known as domino theory. It's going to be used by the Kennedy and Johnson administrations to justify increasing military involvement in Vietnam in the 60s. And they're also going to use domino theory to justify military interventions throughout the global South during the 4 decades of the Cold War. So they're not only going to use domino theory in Southeast Asia, they're going to apply it to conflicts in Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. Let's talk now about 2 revolutions and 2 different responses that the US gives to these 2 revolutions. The first is the Bolivian National Revolution. So let's take it back and see where this revolution begins. The Bolivian economy in 1952, when the revolution takes place, is almost wholly reliant on tin exports. And the tin mining industry is owned by 3 men. They're known as the Tin Barons. At the same time, about 92% of Bolivia's arable land is controlled by just a small portion of the population, all very, very wealthy landowners who maintain indigenous serfs in a feudal state of debt peonage. So they're virtually slaves working on these large haciendas. And these landed elites and the Tin Barons wield enormous political power in Bolivia. And here I have one of the Tin Barons pictured. He's Simone Patino. And underneath, just so you can get an idea of the vast wealth imbalance in Bolivia at the time, this is his home in Cochabamba. I visited the museum that's there last time I was in Bolivia. And the picture is actually from my visit. And it's got gold gilt inside everywhere, and it's the ceilings were painted by French muralists in the style of the Sistine Chapel. It is an incredibly gorgeous mansion built in an area that was surrounded by hungry, landless peasants. And it was built, but the revolution happened before he or his wife had a chance to actually live in this house, which I think is pretty interesting. Like a lot of Latin America, the Bolivian left begins to rise with European immigration and just this kind of disaffection with the landed and tin oligarchy. And so socialist, communist, and anarchist movements begin to develop in urban areas and in the tin mines. A drop in tin prices during the Great Depression really increases the militancy of the unions. And a new idea of indigenismo arises in the 1930s after Bolivia's defeat in the Chaco War with Paraguay. So indigenismo is the idea that certain aspects of indigenous culture should be valorized. Bolivia remains a majority indigenous country. It's one of 2 majority indigenous countries in Latin America. And so these leftist parties began to discuss the plight of indigenous peoples who are impoverished and working under conditions of debt slavery on these large estates. Here we can see some of the people who fought in the Chaco War. You can see the a large number of indigenous faces in that picture. The Chaco War actually brought European mestizo Bolivians and indigenous Bolivians together on the battlefield and sort of changed the way that these different social groups looked at each other. In the 1930s, a couple self-declared military socialist dictators take power, and they implement populist and economic nationalist policies. Around this time, a new political party called the Movimiento Nacional Revolucionario, or the MNR, rise to challenge both the military socialists and that Rosca elite, those 10 miners and wealthy landed elite. In 1951, the MNR won the presidential elections, but the Rosca elite tries to prevent the candidate Victor Paz Censoro from taking office as the president. So some of their allies in the military arm peasants in the peasants in the countryside and the labor unions. And after 3 days of fighting and almost 600 dead, Victor Paz Censoro claims the presidency and declares the start of the 1952 Bolivian National Revolution. The MNR immediately introduced universal suffrage, giving the miners and the peasants who helped bring them to power in the first place the right to vote to help solidify their place in power. It eliminated property and literacy requirements on voting. So indigenous peoples were now allowed to vote. It also created the Central Obrera Boliviano, or the COB, which is a national government recognized labor union. And it actually developed a co-government agreement with the labor movement, where leaders of the labor movement were actually holding cabinet positions. The government nationalized the 10 mines, but under pressure from the United States, the government paid restitution from the 10 barons. I have to say that that miners' union in Bolivia was, until the 1990s, the strongest labor movement perhaps in the entire world. They've been knocked about by neoliberalism, which we'll talk about later, beginning in the 1990s, but they still get out and protest. And this picture is from me just happening to stumble upon them marching in 2018 when I was last in La Paz. In 1953, the MNR introduces an agrarian reform decree. It's the last major reform of the revolution. It's a redistribution program alongside a colonization program to redistribute territory to individual farmers, both in the highlands and in the Amazonian lowlands. This breaks the power of the landed aristocracy in the way that nationalizing the 10 mines breaks the power of the 10 barons. They stopped calling indigenous peoples the pejorative indio and began to call them campesino, which is peasant. And new peasant farmers are actually organized under this central labor union into agrarian unions. So why have we never heard about the United States crushing a revolution that nationalized the 10 mines and introduced agrarian reform? Well, one reason why is because Bolivia is much farther from the United States, say, than Cuba. And there's also a lot less U.S. financial interest in Bolivia than, say, Cuba. But another reason is because President Eisenhower sent his brother on a goodwill tour of Latin America shortly after taking office. And his brother, Milton Eisenhower, actually met with Victor Paz Censoro and came back and reported that not only was he not communist, but Milton really liked him. And so the Eisenhower administration decides that, okay, maybe we can use Paz Censoro and his MNR party as allies to prevent an actual communist takeover of Bolivia. And here I'm going to read just a brief excerpt of a letter that Paz Censoro wrote to Dwight D. Eisenhower in August of 1953, shortly after the revolutionary reforms are beginning to be carried out. And I quote, The qualities of an educator which Dr. Milton Eisenhower possesses, his extraordinary comprehension and his sympathetic grasp of the problems of my country, made it possible for the conversations held with him and his advisors to be carried out with complete frankness and on the level of the broadest cordiality and mutual understanding. I therefore wish to express again to Your Excellency my appreciation of your vision in having asked Dr. Eisenhower to visit Bolivia as your representative. Since that moment, the Bolivian financial situation has deteriorated dangerously. Our availabilities in foreign currency have diminished so considerably during the fall in the price of tin and other minerals that we find ourselves in insurmountable inefficiency of providing food and other articles for people, since in order to import them, we need foreign currency. Such measures as Your Excellency will take in this matter will constitute yet another step in the program of technical and economic collaboration which Bolivia has been receiving from the United States of America and which has made possible the construction of the important Cochabamba Santa Cruz Highway and of certain works in our agricultural and petroleum industries. I believe that Your Excellency will receive this letter with sympathy and goodwill, since it concerns the furnishing of aid to people who, as in the case of Bolivia, are sincerely pledged to improve the democratic institutions inherent in the free world, to which they firmly adhere, and who furthermore are solidly with the principles of mutual security which govern the nations of the Western Hemisphere. In other words, Paz Censoro is asking the government of the United States for economic aid to help his government, because they are committed to fighting communism and being part of the free world. All right. And the U.S. responds initially with what's known as Plan Bohan for the American who drew up this development plan, but is also known as the March to the East. It is a plan to help Bolivia develop its sparsely populated and almost completely undeveloped Amazonian lowlands. So in 1956, the construction of the Cochabamba Santa Cruz Highway is completed. Along that highway, the colonization program begins, moving peasants into the tropical lowlands to expand agricultural production. It lessens the pressure on the land-scarce highlands, and it also helps to settle the lowland against a frontier invasion, which is what happened to Bolivia during the Chaco War that we've talked about. It expands industrialized agriculture in the lowlands, mostly producing sugar and rice. It expands Bolivia's petroleum and gas industries. And the United States both creates and funds this plan. And some of this plan was discussed in the letter, in the short quote from that letter that I read you. The success of this development aid and Bolivia, keeping Bolivia not communist, inspires President John F. Kennedy to make this a region-wide activity. He also, and this is known as the Alliance for Progress. Another reason that John F. Kennedy creates the Alliance for Progress is that as the Cold War begins to heat up in the 1960s, the U.S. and the Soviet Union actually start to get into a war over who can create the most influence through development aid throughout the global South. You have the Latin American nations who have been independent since the 19th century, but in the 50s and 60s, you are seeing the European colonial powers fall throughout Africa and Southeast Asia, offering opportunities for both the Soviet Union and the United States to extend their spheres of influence. The Alliance for Progress is JFK's idea to promote that kind of development aid in Latin America, to improve U.S. Latin American relations, help Latin American nations develop, to kind of keep the people there better fed, better off economically. The idea is that if they're better off economically, they won't, under the capitalist program with U.S. help, then they won't want to be communist. So your short answer quiz 4 is actually designed to help you gain some insight into how internal politics in both the US and in Bolivia affected this aid agreement. You'll also be looking at the author's theory of authoritarian development as anti-communism and his argument that US development aid under the Alliance for Progress laid the groundwork for Bolivia's transition to military dictatorship in 1964. These are the things we're going to be talking about in this lecture. If you have learned any, or in this quiz, if you've learned anything in this lecture and need to get back in and kind of fix some of the stuff in your short answer quiz, please do it. It's still open. You are still able to change things and resubmit. I have no problem with that. Now, the US decided to support Bolivia and then developed a program of support for all of Latin America out of that aid. What's different about Guatemala? Why does the US decide to intervene in Guatemala? So as I talk about the Guatemalan Revolution and the US intervention, I want you to think about what's really different between what happens in Bolivia and what happens in Guatemala. So from 1926 to 1944, Guatemala is under the dictatorial rule of Jorge Ubico, who promotes this banner of stability against economic crisis during the Great Depression. He is staunchly anti-communist, and he passes laws that allow landlords to exploit indigenous peasants very much in the same way that they are being exploited in Bolivia. Under his regime, the United Fruit Company becomes the biggest landholder in Guatemala and comes to own the nation's communications and transportation infrastructure and control a lot of goings on in the Guatemalan government. In October of 1944, a massive popular revolution ends the dictatorship. And shortly after, Juan Jose Arevalo is popularly elected president. Excuse me. My allergies are killing me. All right. His Constitution of 1945 expands voting rights, even gives women the right to vote, social reforms in education and in health, guarantees the rights of organized labor, and calls for an extensive land reform. But he doesn't move incredibly quickly on these reforms. He's very wary of the danger of being overthrown. He finishes his term despite 22 attempts to overthrow him. Then in 1951, Jacobo Arbenz becomes president of Guatemala with 65% of the vote. He legalizes communism, allowing the creation of a Guatemalan Communist Party. He begins large-scale infrastructure projects to construct railroads and telecommunications infrastructure that will compete with the infrastructure owned by the United Fruit Company. And in 1952, his agrarian law threatens lands owned by the Catholic Church, Guatemalan elites, and the United Fruit Company, all of whom run to the United States and scream communist. So a young colonel, Castillo Armas, decides that he can't take it, and the CIA helps him gather, train, and arm an exile force living in Honduras. Once Armas takes over the government, the U.S. immediately recognizes him, and Armas reverses the agrarian law, outlaws communism, and does away with other reforms from Guatemala's brief democratic opening. Module Activity 5 is going to actually ask you to analyze President Eisenhower's speech justifying U.S. support for the coup in Guatemala. It's a little bit shorter than some of your other activities, so I hope it wasn't too much for any of you. I hope it was kind of a nice little break. So the legacies of Guatemala. Guatemala falls into a decades-long civil war that lasts into the 1990s, and the violence of which still rocks rocks the country today. We'll keep talking about that. It sends a message to other Latin American leaders that the U.S. is not going to tolerate any policies that look anything like Soviet-style communism. The strategy of training exiles covertly through the CIA is going to become a blueprint for other Cold War interventions in the region. We'll see that with the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba. We'll also see it with the Contra forces during the Nicaraguan Civil War. And it also started decades of US support for right-wing dictators in the region. So that's the early Cold War. Guatemala kind of begins this descent into authoritarianism in Latin America, but the Cuban Revolution is really, really, really going to kick things off. So your next lecture will cover the Cuban Revolution. So before we go, I want to give you a few hints on your secondary source analysis activity 4. And if you've already kind of done some and want to, again, replace the activity now that you've heard some more advice from me, feel free to do so. Anyhow, I mentioned the word assumptions. So I just want to make sure we all know what I mean by assumptions. Assumptions are elements to an argument for which an author doesn't really provide proper evidence or explanation. So this could be a term that an author uses that they don't define very well, or kind of a causation that the author doesn't prove, just takes for granted, that kind of thing. When I'm asking you to think about how the author is using their sources and how they're addressing bias, I'm asking you to think about whether or not the author is analyzing the sources within their proper context, or are they being misrepresented? Is it some kind of spliced together deep fake, right? I want you to think about that. Now, based on how you answer these two questions and how you assess the collection of sources that the author uses, that's how you can tell me if you think the argument is strong or not, and tell me why. And recognize that this is difficult for those of you who have not ever had to do this before, which is why you have this activity and which is why you'll get feedback from me very quickly. In fact, I am going to make sure I have everything posted through your midterms so that you guys won't be behind in being able to prepare and get everything done. But I also want and then I'll be getting to your grades. And like I said, as soon as I start posting grades, I'll have come up with a plan to kind of even the playing field, since we've made it to the midterm and I just haven't been able to give you as much feedback as I would have liked to. So I'll be thinking about that. You could expect an announcement to come out about that very soon. Okay, thank you all so much. I guess that's all for tonight. So adios, hasta luego.